welcome everyone back to another video. This one is going to be on, let's have a look, the discussion chapter. A really interesting video for people who are doing the discussion chapter. It may be one of those videos you kind of hate because you may have to throw out your discussion chapter. So I'm not saying this is going to be like earth-shattering, world-changing, but I kind of am as well. Whenever I'm correcting people's thesis and I'm talking about the discussion chapter, I always talk about the points I'm going to bring up in this slideshow. And I think it's very important to take stock of these points, because whether you do it now or you do it the last minute, these tips and tricks are just really going to help elevate your thesis to the next level. And it's quite simple. I mean, the discussion chapter, it's lauded as this sort of like, oh my god, I'm going to have to do the discussion chapter. What do I do? No idea what I'm doing. It's really simple. And I'm going to break down how really simple it is, okay? Sorry, I disappeared there for a sec. Tip number one, okay? It's going to be my famous tip videos. So tip number one, use the same headings. Okay, so this is a big one. Use the same headings as your findings chapter. Familiarity aids examiner understanding, the examiner, sorry, that should say, understanding you can make links, as well as allowing them to see you know your topic very well. So even on a very surface level, you're basically just saying to them, okay, look, I understand that the findings chapter is in service to the discussion chapter along with the lit review chapter. So you're basically in the discussion chapter combining the lit review and your findings chapter. So if you're doing that, then why not just use the same headings again in your discussion chapter? So let's say one of the headings in the findings chapter is Team 1, Social Outcasts. When you get to the discussion chapter, you're going to want it to say Team 1, Social Outcasts again. And all it's doing is showing the examiner that you know there's a relationship between your findings and discussion chapter. Okay? Drum roll for tip number 2, the 2-paragraph rule. Okay, so a very famous rule I'm always talking about. And it essentially boils down to, when you're creating a draft of this chapter, the discussion chapter, it's always best to follow the 2-paragraph rule. One paragraph summarizing the theme in question from the findings chapter, and then the second paragraph about how it relates to the literature reviewed earlier in the thesis. It's not something you follow too stringently, like don't be too beholden. Don't just go one paragraph summary, second paragraph relationship to the literature. Just be a bit more, you can sort of like in later drafts, you can hide it a bit better. But essentially all you're doing is saying, here's a summary of what happened in chapter 4 in relation to this theme, and here's how I'm going to relate it to the literature. Yeah, so on the next draft, blend them together a bit better, get rid of the seams. You can improve this when you've learned the basics of academic writing and flow. I'm going to show you the basics of academic writing and flow as we go through these videos. Tip number 3. Balance is key. Balance is key. It's very important, okay, in every aspect of one's life, in college and outside of college. So you're being marked in this chapter on your ability to compare and contrast and evaluate your findings in relation to the literature you reviewed earlier. So make sure there's a good balance between your findings and the literature. Let me stick on my old highlighter pen here. So never let yourself ramble on too much about your findings without relating them back to the literature. Don't just summarize your findings again. That's a very common problem people do tend to fall into. It's a common trap. And it's especially something I correct when I'm going through the thesis, because I'm like, this is just a very different summary of what was in the findings chapter. There's either no lip service paid to the literature, or there's a tacked on piece at the end where it just says, oh, and by the way, this relates to the literature reviewed in chapter 2. There's no mention of which particular literature, or there's no mention of how it relates. So that's very important. Don't just put the name of the author or authors in brackets at the end of the sentence. Show me how it relates. Show me how participant A and what they said about this particular theme. Let me see how that relates to a finding in a similar study. So that's all. You're just basically comparing and contrast. But yeah, don't let yourself ramble on too much about your findings without relating it back to the literature. Yeah, and another very important one is don't go back and forth. So keep the narrative linear. If you're talking about team 1, just keep it there with team 1. Don't go like, and now we're going to talk about team 2, and now we're going to relate it back to team 4. So don't jump back and forth. Keep everything like, if it's team 1, just focus on team 1. If it's team 2, just focus on team 2. And I'd say do the same for the for the discussion chapter, 100%. Because if you start like cross-pollinating teams and talk about like how, well, this team is similar to that team, leave that for the conclusion chapter. because you need to have something to add in the conclusion, and that would make a very good conclusion if you can relate your teams together and how that answers the research question, because that is the point of the conclusion, to do that. Tip, so here it is, tip number 4. Do not confuse with conclusion chapter. Okay, so this is a follow on from what I was basically just saying there, okay? So do not mention the research question, mention limitations, mention implications, mention recommendations and future research. In your discussion chapter, you're only going to be talking about how your findings relate back to previous literature. That's all. There's no need to say it answers the research question, or start mentioning limitations or mention implications. This is you going back and forth if you do that. And your examiner is going to look at that and think, just stick to the point. Just tell me how this theme relates to the literature review you looked at in chapter 2. If you start mentioning the research question, you're jumping the gun. You don't know if it answers the research question because you haven't finished with the discussion chapter yet. And you certainly don't know any limitations until that chapter is over, and by extension, you cannot mention implications or future research if you do not know the conclusion of that discussion chapter, okay? Tip number 5. Nothing new, thanks. Nothing new. So what does this mean? Do not bring up new literature here. It goes into chapter 2. It's a very important point that people always make a mistake on. You might be going through your thematic findings in relation to the previous literature, and you think, you know what? I don't have enough. I'm going to try and bolster this up a bit. I'm going to try and jazz it a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll stick in some literature I just found, and then that'll help. That doesn't help. You end up losing marks for that. Any new literature you found, just put it back into literature review. No one has to know that you found it the day before you did your discussion chapter. Okay, it's not a chronological thesis. You don't have to like a blow-by-blow diary account. You will be going back and forth with, like, you will find probably the best studies you can use to compare with your findings as you're doing the discussion chapter. Well, then in that case, just throw them back into the other chapter. There's no need to start all, introducing them there. And then conversely, do not neglect literature you mentioned in chapter 2. That's a very important one. Don't spend 3 pages talking about a particular topic or concept in your literature review and never mention it again in relation to your findings. The whole point of the discussion chapter is you're using everything in your literature review chapter to answer whether it compares and contrasts to your findings. And if you have a huge section where it doesn't, well, then that looks bad on your account, because in further draft, and this is why drafting is so important. I have a video coming up on drafting. You can't just go, well, draft 1 is done. Here you go. Figure it out yourself. On multiple drafts, you will say, do you know what? Those 3 paragraphs in literature review don't work because I never used them. Just take them out. People worry too much about word count. You can fix up your word count elsewhere, but do not leave stuff in a literature review that has no relevance to it, okay? And as I say here, the goal is to refine the literature review to suit the discussion chapter, and you can do that in multiple drafts later. Yeah, so this happens when you're refining drafts. See, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Tip number 6. I'm going to get a drink of water here because I'm parched. Sweet water. Tip number 6. Follow what came before, okay? Now look at other people's thesis and look at example in Word doc. I will indeed. I'll look at example in the Word doc in a second, okay? But I want to look at this one first. I have a video coming up on looking at other people's thesis and how to use other people's thesis in a sufficient manner where you're not just copying and pasting, plagiarizing, and generally just putting no work in. It's a very important thing to see what came before and to follow that. It just works so well, and it works better than looking at academic published work and trying to ape that style and ape that structure, because you're not being asked to produce a piece of academic published work. You've been asked to produce a thesis, the structure of which is different from published work, So that's my final word on that, is to look at other people's thesis online. Now we've come to the end of this video. I hope it has gave you some pause to think about where you're going with your discussion chapter, because it is very important to make sure that these points are followed. And even if you can sort of say to yourself, do you know what, all I've done in the discussion chapter is compared my findings to the previous literature, that's all that's expected of you. Answering a research question, talking about future research, limitations, all that sort of stuff, that comes in the conclusion chapter. So we won't worry about that for now. So I would say have a look through these slides again on the video and just make sure that your discussion chapter is matching those ones, okay?